Welcome back. Today we are going to talk about the Kiwi Ears KE4. So this is what it looks like up close. It's actually a nice kind of a brushed metal looking faceplate underneath some resin. Shell is black resin, but can't actually see into it to see any of the drivers. There is a 2 dynamic driver, 2 balanced armatures hiding in there, which we cannot see. These tips are actually cool tips. I think a couple brands have this style with maybe the propeller, I guess is what they're called. I think one brand actually calls it the propeller. But yeah, it's pretty cool. I actually like these tips maybe more than I thought I was going to. So really nice choice of stock tips. And yeah, I thought that was pretty nice. Cable is okay. You do get a case. So all of this for about $200. And, you know, I think if you have read anything about KE4, you know, the majority of what's special about this set isn't the cable or the faceplates, it's the tuning. So we'll kind of jump into it quickly and we'll say what is it. I already talked about it. It's a nice playback. It's a nice safe sounding 2 dynamic driver, 2 balanced armatures. So meta tuning is really the thing that KE4 is sort of known for. It is maybe the cheapest set that actually conforms to the meta target, or at least the bass boosted meta target. So when we talk about that, is the hype real or is it just hype? And I think this one is close. I think it needs some tweaks. And, you know, just to kind of run over some of these things, when we talk about the meta target and as it becomes more familiar and people start talking more about it, you see a lot of this conformance to the target, the JM1. And what does this sound like? I have no idea what it sounds like, but you can kind of see that between Critical's Meta version 3 and Kiwi Ears KE4, they both are pretty conformant to each other and to the target, but most people have no idea what this sounds like. So not going to talk too much about that, but some of the goals behind, I think, the Meta target are actually right on. And here you can kind of see the way these are aligned. I tried to kind of point out or maybe emphasize the things that are a little bit going to come to fruition, hopefully, with the meta target as it evolves. But a lot of it is this, you know, as I said, this one is going to be bass boosted. And if you just look at this graph, this is the normal Hobbyist 711 style graph for the same set. Bass boosted, kind of a lower treble. And those two things, I think the meta tries to address in that, giving you a more neutral style bass, but lift the mid bass, kind of this lower mid part, the part that Harman Target is a bit lean on. So make your lower mid sound a little bit more natural, a little bit fuller. Get rid of the Harman style shout at 2K or so. So bring this whole level down. So between adding fuller mids and less shouty mids, I think these are the two changes to give you more natural sounding mids, and then a treble that is non-fatiguing and, you know, doesn't and tries to be more neutral in that respect. So fuller mids, less shouty mids, and then a more natural style extension. I think those are 3 things that are going to fall out of the target. And as I said, this one is kind of close. It probably needs some tweaks, and we'll kind of get to those in a second. But I think that's the gist of what's going on. And I think starting with the KE4 in particular, and I would say the KE, and I will sort of separate KE4 from the target itself or the meta tuning itself. I think this is an execution or implementation of the target, or it's a set that is tuned to the target. And there are specifics to it that probably aren't going to exist with other sets. But in particular, with this one, I think this one does have a more mid-centric or better mid sound. Definitely fuller mids, but the balance is sort of off on this one. Like I said, the treble is just a little bit lower. So this one sounds a little bit too inward, a little bit closed in, not as dynamic as it should be. And you can certainly turn it up to crazy levels, but there isn't really a reward for doing so. It doesn't actually get that much better. It sounds better, but I wouldn't say it takes it to the point where it's worth listening to it at such a high level. There wasn't that much of a bonus for doing so. I think it was better to EQ it and just put a little bit more energy and have it be a little bit more engaging in the treble. The lower mids are slightly boosted, like we talked about, and that does create a thicker, fuller sound, but the treble is very anti-shout, very almost too safe for it to sound engaging and lively. And like I said, I think the goal there was, I think they hit the goal, right? To do this as a not shout, anti-shout, relaxed. You know, I think there's versions of bringing this level down way under Harman, so it still sounds pleasing and natural, but it still needs a little bit of energy to balance out with the boost that they did here. And I think this overall balance is kind of okay for playback, but not exactly for people who are used to hearing lots and lots of IEMs and technical style hybrids. I think this one is just a little bit off in that respect. I think it does sound a little bit compressed. It does lack dynamics and nuance, and it sounds lower resolution than it is. I think it sounds like a hybrid tune, like a dynamic driver, but the drivers are better than they appear. And like I said, when you start EQing it, you sort of get the idea that it's a 2+2 and they're actually sort of decent drivers, but the tuning isn't necessarily complementing what the drivers can do. I think this is another one of these sets that they hit the target and it's very conformant to the target, but not necessarily conformant to where these drivers can sound best and the levels where they sound best. I think it was a really interesting balance of implementing and executing meta tuning on a set of drivers that may not be perfect for doing the meta tuning. But is it likable? Is it very general appealing? I think the answer is yes. I think it does have really nice playback. And if you gave this set to someone who doesn't listen to IEMs and they put on their favorite Taylor Swift tracks, I think that would sound just like Taylor Swift. They would have a good time and it would sound very enjoyable to them. But perhaps not if you are used to hearing lots of IEMs, and perhaps if you are a hybrid tech fan, this one, probably doesn't really scratch that itch. It does have a fun bass level and it does have a relaxed upper range, and that will suit some preferences. But for people who are kind of looking for a 2+2 and to sound a little bit more technical than your average single dynamic driver, this one is sort of tuned more like a single dynamic driver. So the bass, again, this sub bass boosted kind of still sounds a little bit cushy and on the thicker side. It's really not my favorite style sub bass. And I'll kind of go back to the graph and say, when you're trying to add fuller mids here, to have cleaner mids here, and bring down the treble level and still have a kind of a complementary addition to the mids, it's really hard to have this much sub bass because it's going to dominate this lower treble. This isn't going to have as much contribution to the mids as you think it is because there's a whole lot going on here. And again, I'll just say that the balance was just kind of slightly off in that respect. So, I think the goal is to have fuller mids, better mids, cleaner mids. So yeah, I think my preference would have been to bring down the sub bass level. That would have given you cleaner style mids, more clarity to the mids, and without the need to boost the treble to get over the sub bass, which is kind of the way it sounds as it is out of the box. So yeah, I think it's just kind of an interesting tuning the way they did it, and conforming to the graph or the target, I sort of get that, but I do think that too much sub bass softens the sound and it's a distraction stepping out from the mids if you listen to tracks that have sub bass. And on the mids, again, I like the idea of the tuning, especially creating a fuller, less shouty mids, and I think it does that kind of well. But it's almost too much of a good thing, right? It's almost an overcompensation of what they did. The mids kind of lost their sparkle. It sounds a little bit closed in rather than open as they should be. Part of it is there's too much sub bass. Part of it is it's really conservative treble level, and it doesn't have a really heavy contribution to the mids, and it kind of lost that sparkle of what you're expecting to be on top of the mids from the treble. It kind of sits below and doesn't really have as much contribution as you think it's going to from the graph. And I do think it's slightly frustrating that the tuning doesn't match the capabilities of the driver. And like I said, I think the drivers are actually pretty good, and if you EQ them, they sound better. And perhaps they just force the graph over what sounds right. And I think that's kind of a bit of what they did here. They certainly hit the target, and it's certainly conformant to it, but not necessarily what was good for the drivers that are in the shell. And the treble, again, I think the idea is right. Remove that shouty, over-energetic lower treble from that Harman. Replace it with more natural levels. And more of a mid-centric or neutral-style treble is actually quite difficult to pull off. And it needs to be either one step below the mids or neutral and kind of at the same level of the mids. If you go below that, any more of that, it tends to disappear and it doesn't add to the mids, and that's kind of exactly what you have here. The mids are missing that sparkle in the upper dynamics and sound a little bit bottom heavy. So again, I'll say that this combination of balance with a nice fun bass with this relaxed treble Definitely decent playback for people who don't have a whole lot of IEMs and they want to hear the meta style tuning. I think it does decent playback and it sounds nicely tuned, but not really the experience that you might be expecting if you have lots of IEMs and you have other hybrids and you like this big, open, huge sound. It doesn't quite do that. It's definitely more of an execution of a tuning style as opposed to an IEM tuned to these particular drivers. And I think the stage, again, going to be very variable with the sub bass and the lower treble level and the fit. A lot of things are kind of working against the stage on this one. And fit is one that was kind of interesting. If it sounds very in your head, if you tend to push it in a little bit deeper, it tends to blow out just a little bit, sounds a little bit larger. I don't know. I wouldn't say that that was all the time, but I definitely noticed it a couple times I put it in and it sounded smaller than it should. Pushed in a little bit deeper. Maybe it's the tips, maybe it's the treble, whatever it is. But definitely play with the stage. It was definitely variable depending on what track you were listening to and how big it sounded. So that's what I got on KE4. So thank you guys again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.